looking at the SHINE study, which is a trial that is ongoing that looks at WASH and infant and young child feeding interventions for the prevention of stunting in young children. We have 5 presenters, and I have been assured that it will go along very quickly. So they will each speak, but they should be done within an hour, after which we'll have a time for question and answer. Also, we are live casting this session for others that are not based here in Harare and are able to follow proceedings, just for you to be able to know. At the end of this, we'll pass along the link, because this is always on YouTube as well, in case you'd like to share with others that were not able to make it here this afternoon. So without much ado, let me now introduce Jean Humphrey, who is the lead on this study, to come up here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for coming today. So as everyone in this room probably knows, stunting is defined as short stature for age. So just stand in front of the camera.
Yeah.
Okay. How's this? You get all this light in your eye too. Okay. It affects about 1/4 of children in developing countries. It occurs between conception and 2 years of life. So this, sorry, is that printed on this side? No.
Yeah. So we can take it forward. Yes.
I'm going to use my finger. At birth, children in Asia, Latin America, and Africa are born about half a standard deviation below normal length for age. And then that length for age falls dramatically away from normal, plummeting to about 24 months, when the average child in Asia and Africa is 2 HAZ scores less than normal. The reason we care about child stunting is not because we want everyone to be tall, but because it's so directly correlated with neurocognitive development and resilience throughout life. Stunting causes up to 17% of preschool under 5 mortality. At school age, children who are stunted at age 2 attend fewer years of school and perform more poorly while they're there. During adulthood, children who were stunted at age 2 grow up to be adults with significantly lower economic productivity. They earn less money as adults, and they're more likely to have stunted children. And almost poignantly, they're more likely to have diseases of chronic disease, the diseases that we usually think of as being associated with wealthier countries: obesity, hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease. So they become an economic burden to society at both ends of the age spectrum. Causes stunting. What most of us have been working on for decades is how to feed children better so that they'll grow. This review done in 2008 by Kay Dewey showed that systematically looking at the impact of complementary feeding on stunting, the very best nutrition programs and studies where infant diet was targeted improved linear growth, but only by about 0.7 of a z-score against a deficit of -2. So what we can say is that the very best optimizing infant diet can do is remove about 1/3 of the stunting problem. That's about as far as we can get with optimizing infant diet. A second culprit that has been studied widely is prevalent diarrhea, and we know that diarrhea is prevalent in the same age group of under 2-year-old children. But this analysis of 7 studies showed that at 2 years of age, a child who had the average amount of diarrhea was 0.38 of a centimeter shorter than a child who'd had no diarrhea at all in the first 2 years of life. And that 0.38 of a centimeter at 2 years is only equal to 0.13 of a length for age z-score, which is 7% of the average deficit of -2. What this study suggests, or this meta-analysis suggests, is that if we could eliminate child diarrhea amongst under 2-year-olds, we could solve about 7% of the stunting problem. So we have a big problem affecting at least a quarter of the children in developing countries that we largely don't know how to solve. We know that diet plays a part, we know that diarrhea prevention and infection prevention plays a part, but the largest part of stunting we still don't understand. And this was the reason for doing the SHINE trial. Good clues to us came from a series of studies conducted in the Gambia by the Dunn Nutrition Center over several decades, where they followed children's growth, diarrhea, and diet over many years, and showed that stunting was not associated with poor diet, nor was it necessarily associated with days sick with diarrhea, but what it was associated with was intestinal injury, or intestinal permeability, mucosal injury. And what this is called is environmental enteric dysfunction, or EED. It's in the literature also called tropical enteropathy, or sometimes environmental enteropathy. It's all the same thing. And the premise of the SHINE trial is that we're testing the hypothesis that a primary underlying cause of stunting is this subclinical gut disease. So what is EED? Well, on the left hand, the first thing to say about it is that it's subclinical. Children with EED don't have tummy aches or diarrhea. They don't have symptoms. So it's a subclinical condition of a flat, permeable gut. Andy Prendergast, who's going to speak with you next, worked out this way of teaching our nurses what EED is. So if everybody does this with you. A normal gut lumen has long villi, lots and lots and lots of absorptive capacity for absorbing nutrients. And, really importantly, an intact gut wall. The wall separating the lumen, the inside of the intestine, with the rest of the body, the bloodstream, is only one cell thick. In environmental enteric dysfunction, you have 2 things. First, you get these short villi, so you get reduced nutrient absorption. But perhaps even more important, you get holes where microbes can translocate or cross across the intestinal gut wall. And when they do that, they trigger a chronic immune activation in the child, so that the child is constantly fighting a subclinical infection that's diverting whatever nutrients he is eating away from growth and to this infection or fighting or survival. So this is the hypothesis of the SHINE trial. The EED is a major underlying cause of stunting, that it can be reduced through interventions that will protect children from ingesting feces. That a major causal pathway linking poor WASH to stunting is not diarrhea, but EED. So our hypothesis is that the reason the WASH interventions are going to reduce stunting is not by reducing diarrhea, which they also do, but by reducing the subclinical intestinal disorder. And finally, that the effects of optimizing diet at the same time as minimizing fecal ingestion will be additive on stunting, so that we'll be able to see effects from both interventions when combined. So before we could test this hypothesis, we spent about 5 years on formative research to answer this question. How can we interrupt fecal oral transmission in infants and young children? So we started with conventional WASH interventions, a Blair VIP, which is the standard sanitation unit in Zimbabwe, discovered here, the most highly exported public health intervention from Zimbabwe, and a tippy top on the right of soap and water for hand washing and water guard for drinking water treatment. But then we asked ourselves this question, that food and water are the main things older people in the family put in their mouth. But what about breastfed babies who receive the majority of their fluid and nutrient needs through breast milk, which is clean? How do feces get into the mouths of young babies? So we did a baby observation study in 2011. And at that time, Daddy Fundera, who's there in the blue skirt and is now a PhD student at Cornell, was one of the observers, where they observed 20 babies for 6 hours and wrote down everything they put in their mouth over that time and what it looked like before it went into their mouth. And what we were looking for were what were the most common things that went into the mouth, even if they weren't that dirty, and what were the dirtiest things that went into the mouth, even if they weren't, it didn't go in quite as often. So the most frequent things that went into the mouth were the child's left and right hand, on average 38 times in 6 hours. 75% of that time, the child's hand was visibly dirty when it went into their mouth. But the dirtiest thing that we were surprised at is the level of geophagia, which is eating dirt. Children sitting and eating large numbers of mouthfuls of soil and direct exposure to chicken feces, directly consuming whole chicken feces because of living very closely with free-roaming chickens. We went back with the microbiologists and took samples of those vectors, the hands, the chicken feces, and the soil, and also the infant food and the drinking water, and calculated based on our observation how much E. coli was a baby getting on average through exposure from food, water, soil, particularly soil in the wet, shaded part of the yard, near where the mother is doing laundry or washing dishes and is out of the bright sun, which is exactly where she wants her child to be playing, near her, and chicken feces itself. And what you can see on that last column is that the average E. coli consumed per day by children, by under 18-month-old children, from soil or chicken feces was completely trumped, overwhelmed the exposure that they were getting through food or water. We're not the first ones to show this. It's been shown in Peru and Bangladesh as well, that toddlers living in close proximity to chicken feces eat chicken feces. So the SHINE study is being done in 2 rural districts in Midlands Province, Shirugwi and Chiramanzu. It's a 2x2 factorial design trial, which allows us to measure the independent and the combined effects of these 2 interventions, improving infant diet and improving baby wash. And baby wash here, we mean particular interventions that will reduce fecal oral transmission in young babies. And our primary outcomes are child stunting or length at 18 months and anemia at 18 months. SHINE is a cluster randomized trial where the clusters are equal to the catchment area of a village health worker. So we chose to implement all the behavior change interventions through the already existing village health worker system, which is the bedrock of the Ministry of Health and Child Care. So essentially, we were randomizing village health workers to deliver different public health programs. Now, these are the 4 arms. The standard of care was a revived village health worker network with strengthened PMTCT and promotion of exclusive breastfeeding. And we implemented a special promotion of exclusive breastfeeding intervention that Naomi Tavengo is going to tell you about when I sit down. The infant nutrition arm included everything in standard of care plus targeted messages around optimal use of locally available food for complementary feeding, including demonstrations so that mothers could see how to prepare these foods for young children, and the supplement of NutriButter, which provided about 100 calories and all of the micronutrient needs of a child. The sanitation hygiene arm included the latrine, 2 tippy taps with soap that is dispersed every month, water guard, a play space to protect children from eating chicken feces and eating dirt, and specific messages to parents about avoiding allowing their children to eat these things, and promotion of hygienic infant food preparation. And then the arms randomized to get both IYCF and WASH got all those interventions together. The foundation of the SHINE trial implementation are the 400 Ministry of Health village health workers in the 2 districts. They initially conducted prospective pregnancy surveillance to identify mothers early in pregnancy. That is, they kept a register of all the women 15 to 49 in their catchment area, went round to them every 5 weeks, asked if they'd had a menstrual period. If they'd missed one, offered a urine pregnancy test, and referred them first to antenatal care, which really improved early booking for PMTCT for HIV-positive mothers, and referred them to SHINE. This allowed us to recruit 5,282 women between November of 2012 and March of 2015 at an average of 12.5 weeks gestation. And then we're still following those babies that we recruited until the last one turns 18 months, about next April. The interventions, the WASH and IYCF intervention each had 5 key modules with special interactive tools and activities to help mothers learn the messages. And the WASH arm mothers received a Blair VIP latrine and a tippy tap within 6 weeks of recruitment. I should just say that all the latrines were built under the supervision of the district level environmental health technicians and local latrine construction, local latrine builders. Outcome measurements. So we have village health workers delivering interventions. We have a second group of people, research nurses, who are measuring the outcomes. And the primary outcomes are measured at 18 months, but we have preliminary outcomes that are measured at when the baby is 1, 3, 6, 12, and 18 months. And research nurses do these measurements, and Andy is going to tell you a little bit more about this. They travel on motorbike, and all of the visits are done in the home. So where we are right now, as of August 31st, just a month ago, 75% of the cohort had completed his 18-month visit. We'll finish all data collection next July, and we'll have trial primary outcomes ready for public dissemination in January of 2018. I'm going to turn over to Naomi Tavengwa, who directs our field operations in SHINE.
Thank you, Jean. I'm going to proceed on the intervention on exclusive breastfeeding, the impact of this intervention to promote exclusive breastfeeding in the SHINE study. Why do we care about breastfeeding? We know that breastfeeding includes those 3 components which are being promoted to initiate breastfeeding in the first hour, and then exclusively breastfeed the baby from birth to 6 months, and to continue with breastfeeding up to 24 months or beyond. Why do we care about exclusive breastfeeding? Why is it so important? We know that, as Jean said, it is a blanket intervention across all the arms. So between birth and 6 months, the more a baby is exclusively breastfed, then the lower the risk of that child has, in terms of infant death. So if the baby is exclusively breastfed, I think the slide is showing that the more you introduce other stuffs to the baby, the more the chances or the risk of that baby dying. You see, if there is no breastfeeding at all, it's as high as 14 times or 14-fold. So we do care about exclusive breastfeeding. And in the SHINE study, we needed to follow the baby so they had their life. Over the years, we've been trying the world over to try to increase the rates of exclusive breastfeeding. And you can see how painfully slow it is from 1993 when it has been followed up. And the goal we have in 2025 is to reach at 50%, exclusive breast rate. But at this rate, will we get there? If we continue that way, it means that the increase is just 0.5, points per year, but the World Health Assembly target is up to 50%. So we need to double our efforts to achieve that goal. So how did we do it in SHINE? We also looked at our demographic health survey in Zimbabwe, how breastfeeding, the story of breastfeeding has been going. We see that we have done well in the first hour in terms of initiating breastfeeding in the first hour up to 75%, and then feeding the baby up to 12 months, 89%, since we are a breastfeeding culture. But looking at the exclusivity of it, we see that only 23% of babies are breastfed from birth to the 6-month age. And then when we look, that graph, it's showing exactly what the DHS data is showing, that within the first month, as we start, only 60% of the babies are being exclusively breastfed. And it halves as the baby grows. Only 3 months is at 30%, and further reduced half to 15% by 5 to 6 months. So we have got a problem with. So as SHINE, team, we set out to identify, to really understand why is it a problem to exclusive breastfeed? Why are the rates so low? And when breastfeeding really is the norm in this culture or in this country. So we knew that once we understand the reasons behind, that will guide us to develop an intervention that will then intervene in the study. We carried out a formative research study along with what Jim said about the eating of the date, interrupting that. We carried out to understand the issues around breastfeeding itself. So 2 areas emerged as we understood that it's more like the time or the age of the baby determines what the mothers will give to the baby. So in the first month or in the first 2 months, really what they were giving, it wasn't perceived as food. It was being given to prevent or to treat, 2 perceived problems. The issue of NOA, most of us, we know the fontanelle, and then the Rizoka colic pain, and what they were giving mostly, it was cooking oil, water, and traditional medicines. Mind you, I said they did not see this as feeding, but it interrupted exclusive breastfeeding. And then in the second month of the baby's life, what they perceived was the baby wasn't getting enough to sustain its needs. So the mothers started giving porridge because they believed that their breast milk didn't provide enough food for the baby. So with all this, we then developed our EBF intervention, exclusive breastfeeding intervention, which are messages which were going to be delivered at the 7-month gestation, at birth, at 1 month, and at 3 months. And these messages were accompanied by interactive tools. So you see, in the first module was to talk about the knowledge itself around exclusive breastfeeding. And then the second one, talking intensively about the fontanelle. I've got a few flyers here, which shows the picture of the skull itself. and that the fontanelle is really normal for the baby to have. And what we have to look out for, really, there are signs which either the baby is having enough or not, and then what you will do. And then we went on to proper positioning and attachment so that the baby really gets enough to suckle. And then issues around the colic as the third set of messages given at 1 month, and then the assurance of the sufficiency of breast milk entering and introducing solid food. So I also have some interactive tools which I can pass around for you to see, which will then help the village health worker and the mother to visualize what is happening. This is a picture of a village health worker there in brown, talking to the mother or any significant person who happens to be around, including the husband, the mothers-in-law, and anyone who is there. The village health worker will carry out a discussion with the family. So, having done all that, and putting the first graph that I showed you on the 2010 demographic, which is in white, and the black one is what we have achieved in the SHINE study. In the first month, you see that from the 60% in SHINE study, it's way up above 80%. And by the second month, the DHS data is still at 60, but we are way up there above 80%. And as we go down, even when it is half to 30%, we are still above 80% in terms of exclusive breastfeeding. And then when we go down to the 6th month there, we are just below 70%, and yet the countrywide, the DHS data is at 15%. So I think the graph says for itself what we have achieved. So we are saying it's doable in terms of using the village health workers, the 400, to deliver the messages in the district. So I hand over to Dr. Andy, who is going to talk about subscribing. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. So you heard a lot about the trial, about the interventions that are taking place across 2 districts in rural Zimbabwe. And so clearly this provides some opportunities for us to ask some additional questions on top of the primary question about the randomized interventions that we're giving. So I'm going to give an overview of really 7 add-on studies that we now have in SHINE, just to give you a flavour for other things going on. So I'm not presenting results because these are all ongoing, but to give you a flavour of some of the other things happening down in Midlands. So the first is that we really want to understand this process that's called EED, to sort of understand exactly what does drive stunting and whether the WASH and the IYCF interventions actually ameliorate those processes. So to do that, Jean said that all of our SHINE nurses visit the child's home on motorbikes, and so we actually collect biological specimens from a subgroup of children. So we collect blood, urine, stool, saliva, to be able to measure biological markers of the kind of processes that Jean describes. And you can see here some scenes from training up primary care nurses who left nursing school and came to work for SHINE, and really had to learn to take specimens from babies, learn to ride motorbikes, learn anthropometry, and they're now sort of experts, some of them 4 years into the program. And you can see here a chicken just kind of wandering across the scene here as this nurse tries to take a clean blood sample from a baby. So quite challenging to do all this in the home, but what we've done is to set up laboratories, 4 laboratories in the middle of the field, where we can process samples, have a generator to store samples at -80 degrees before transferring them up to Jitambo here in Harare. So really we're going to be able to look at this biological pathway that leads from environmental contamination through to stunting and try and figure out how these interventions work. And one of the tests we can do is called a lactulose mannitol test. So this is a nurse who's drawing up some sugar water that's given to the baby, and the babies quite enjoy drinking this. And the gut structure that Jean was talking about which is impaired in EED, we can get a handle on what's going on inside the gut by measuring how much of that sugar gets into the urine. So we give the baby this dose of sugar water, we collect the baby's urine for 2 hours using a bag, and by seeing how much of these 2 different sugars have made it into the urine, it actually gives us a clue as to how healthy the gut is. Clearly, we can't do things like endoscopies and collect biopsy samples from small babies in the middle of rural Zimbabwe. So this gives us a bit of an insight into that kind of black box inside the abdomen as to kind of what's going on. So the second study we're looking at is looking more at diarrhea in these babies. As Jean said, there's 2 predominant pathways through which a WASH intervention might work. One is reducing diarrhea, the sort of standard approach that people conceive of with a WASH intervention. The second is reducing the subclinical condition of EED. And we really want to tease apart how important each of those pathways are. And so all the babies who are in this sub-study, this EED sub-study, they also keep a daily diary. And so we ask the mother every day to record whether the child had any symptoms. So on the days with an X, that baby was healthy. On other days, the mother places a sticker if the child has fever or dysentery or diarrhea. So we can see this is a baby who spent half the month being unwell, and we'll be able to see how much does that contribute to poor growth compared to this subclinical condition of EED. So the third add-on study is to think about the mothers themselves. So we're recruiting mothers early in pregnancy. And if this condition of EED is prevalent in rural areas, then clearly the mother is living in the same homestead as the baby. And it may well be that the mother herself has this subclinical inflammatory condition of the gut as well. And the reason that might be relevant is that we know that inflammation, this process of the immune system being activated during pregnancy, leads to adverse birth outcomes. So inflammation is a clear cause of preventing a fetus growing properly, and also the onset of preterm labour. And it may just be that one of the sources of inflammation is this gut condition that's also prevalent among adults in this setting. So we're measuring the same markers in the mothers during pregnancy. And just as an aside, for people in the sort of WASH arena, this was a study in India, which recruited 670 women early in pregnancy and looked at adverse pregnancy outcomes. So low birth weight, fetal loss, prematurity, and found that open defecation, when you adjusted for other socioeconomic conditions, was associated with a more than 2-fold increased risk of having an adverse birth outcome. And specifically preterm birth was a particularly high signal. So suggesting that improving WASH has some impact potentially on birth outcomes. Now, we don't know whether that will be the case in these mothers who have quite a short exposure to improved WASH during pregnancy, but it may be that cleaning up the environment is very important for their next pregnancy, for example. And it does suggest some link between the environment and pregnancy outcomes. So the fourth opportunity is to look at oral vaccine responses in babies. And the reason for that is that we know rotavirus was rolled out in Zimbabwe in 2014. And yet we know that oral vaccines in developing countries are far less effective than oral vaccines in Europe and the US. And one of the hypothesized reasons is that the gut is not as healthy in babies living in impoverished conditions, and that this condition of EED may prevent an oral vaccine like polio or rotavirus from taking properly across the gut wall. And that may be one of the reasons why oral vaccines don't work as well in Africa and South Asia. And so what we'll be able to look at is whether a WASH intervention actually improves the uptake, the take of rotavirus vaccine in these babies who are all getting it as part of EPI now in Zimbabwe. The fifth question we're asking is around body composition. So the primary outcome of the study is to see how tall children become at 18 months of age. But it's possible that a nutrition intervention in early life might increase weight and height of babies, but potentially lead to weight gain from unhealthy fat gain rather than lean mass gain. And so one of the things that we've actually just rolled out in the last week is starting these assessments of body composition. So this was in the field last week, a baby who's been connected up to a little machine that you can't see very clearly here, but you connect a couple of wires onto the hand, a couple onto the ankle. It passes a tiny electric current through the body that you can't feel. People may have had it done themselves in gyms or pharmacies, and it tells you how much of the baby's body is lean mass, muscle, healthy mass, compared to fat mass. And so what we'll be able to see is if we give an intensive nutrition intervention, are we helping these babies to actually have a long-term healthy body composition or not? And we can also look at body proportions. So here's a baby having the lower leg measured, because we know that's the part of the body that particularly takes a hit in stunting. The brain tends to be preserved, the body tends to take a hit, and it may be a more sensitive marker of our interventions. So I'm going to pass over now to Laura Smith. So Laura did her PhD at Cornell University, working with us in Zimbabwe. Got her PhD earlier this year and has stayed on as a postdoc at Chitambo and is leading our work on mycotoxins.
Thank you. So we have mycotoxins in the SHINE trial, not because we're intervening on mycotoxins, it's not part of the WASH and nutrition hypothesis, but that when we started this trial, we learned that perhaps mycotoxins and exposure to that during pregnancy and young infancy might be another cause of adverse birth outcomes and poor child growth. So we decided to measure this. So what are mycotoxins? They are toxins produced by mold. There's over thousands of these mycotoxins, but there's a few that are particularly of concern for child health. And those ones are fumonisin, deoxynivalenol, and aflatoxin. Aflatoxin itself you might have heard of. It's a potent liver carcinogen, and so it's dangerous regardless of the effects on young children. And these are just a couple of pictures of the molds that produce these toxins. So exposure, just a little about this, can be really highly variable. So first, it depends on what happens in the field. It depends on drought, even water, stress, soil quality, elevation, and plant disease and high temperatures. And so this past year in 2016 was a really bad year for the production of these toxins, because what we had is we had drought, we had late rains, so we had drought during when the crops needed the rain, and then the rains continued during harvest season, so often people were harvesting crops that weren't fully dried. Then along the pathway, once it goes into storage, these molds can continue to accumulate depending on the storage conditions. And so if the area is moist or wet, then the molds will continue. And so what you can have is very little of these toxins when you harvest your grain, and then humongous amounts 3 months later. And then whether it actually affects a human or not depends on whether people are eating it, and then also sort of concurrent diseases and infections in the body. And in Zimbabwe in particular, I had another slide that's not here. As you might guess, 99.9% of people eat maize every day, and about half of people have eaten groundnuts in the past 24 hours. And so the sort of vectors for exposure to these toxins, the consumption of those foods is really high. And why are we interested in SHINE? Andy gave a brief overview of some of our maternal studies and then also looking at child growth. What we think is that exposure to these toxins might affect adverse birth outcomes and also child growth through possibly some of the same mechanisms as the EED. So through potentially inflammation, causing inflammation in the body that diverts nutrients away from growth to fighting the infection. And so these are just a few preliminary results from the work that we've done thus far. We started off by measuring to see, do we have this problem in our 2 study districts? And we found that 30% of the women that we measured in this preliminary study had been exposed to aflatoxin in the last 2 days, which was something that we were quite surprised that it was that high. And this is a figure showing exposure throughout the 2013-2014 calendar year in 1,600 women. And what you see is in no month do you have no exposure. So the dark red on the bottom is those that are the most highly exposed, and then the other tertiles of exposure. And you see on the left is in April, so at harvest, and then it continues throughout the year. You have over 50% of women exposed in these two study districts in May, and there's a lot of variability over the years that we can talk about how to explain that. One thing, we found this bump in January, and this is also a time when you have an early harvest of maize. And this maize is often not quite dry when it's harvested, which could be potentially the reason for that increase during that time. So then we wanted to see what sort of variability we had in our study region and what might cause this, what might determine whether someone's exposed to aflatoxin or not. And this is our study region. You saw the map that Jean had earlier of the randomization. This is basically the percent of people that are exposed within each of the wards in our study district. And the same as the over the calendar year, you see there's not really a great area. There's much worse areas, and it's fairly ubiquitous. But also that this particular area in the southeast portion is quite a bit higher. This is a communal farming land with very sandy soil that is maize is a very predominant sort of crop there. And so one of the things also is that it's lower elevation. We found that elevation was significantly associated with aflatoxin exposure. So our plans are to continue measuring these toxins in mothers and young children and look at the potential that exposure to these toxins contributes to that whole pie of the stunting that Jean showed you earlier. And so I would like to introduce Gwen Kandawashika, who's going to talk about early childhood development. You're
welcome. Good afternoon. So why early childhood development at 24 months? We know that 1 in 3 children, particularly in resource-limited settings, do not reach their full developmental potential at 5 years due to a variety of reasons, especially environmental, biological, and even psychological. And there is evidence to highlight that stunting is linked to poor neurocognitive outcomes. However, there are no large-scale studies on the impact of WASH intervention on early childhood development. Now the question is, do toilets make children any smarter? Early childhood development covers the physical development, social development, and cognitive changes in a child from birth to 24 months. When we talk of physical changes, we're talking about acquisition of gross and fine motor skills. Social, mostly temperament and social skills, the ability to be socially intelligent. Cognitive, usually interested in language acquisition, memory, and decision making. So how are we going to measure these early childhood development outcomes? One of the tools we're going to use is the MacArthur-based Communication Developmental Inventory, which has been adapted for Zimbabwe. It is a simple to use language inventory, looking at word lists, gestures, and short phrases. In studies that have used the same tool in Malawi and Kenya and Uganda, they show good validity and reliability. And we're proud to say that this is the first time it has been adopted for Shona. We're also going to use the Malawi Developmental Assessment Tool. And this will assess development for our purposes up to the age of 24 months. And these are some of the items that are there. It covers the age range 0 to 6 years, and it's about 162 items, but I'm just showing you 4 of them. The first picture is showing a child who's demonstrating if he can walk straight, and the second one, the child is being assessed on ability to jump from a certain height. On the fourth one is also demonstrating ability to thread beads through and all this is done in a timed fashion. We're also going to use the A, not B, task. This is assesses memory and object permanence. This tool has been validated in Kenya, in Malawi, Uganda, and Ghana. Delayed inhibition is also part of cognitive assessment. It assesses temperament and emotional control. In the picture there, the evaluator takes a snack and puts it under a cup and tells the child to wait. It seems a little bit cruel, but the same grain will be assessing the child's maturity. It has been validated in Uganda, Kenya, Ghana, and Malawi. There's been strong association between the delayed inhibition tool with low birth weight, malnutrition, socioeconomic status, and maternal education, particularly in studies that were done in Malawi. Observed maternal and child interaction. We know that the amount of interaction, particularly stimulation, is important for the development of the children. So in this slide, we are also going to assess caregiver and child interaction. In particular, in this particular slide, we just observe how the mother interacts with the child using a simple book. At this point, I'll invite Andy to take us through the summary.
Great, thanks. So I think we've come in under an hour, Victor. So what we've tried to give is really an overview of everything that's going on in SHINE. Clearly, we're going to kind of keep you waiting, I'm afraid, a bit longer to actually get the main results from the trial towards the end of next year, the beginning of 2018. I think just to point out, because this is a research trial rather than a program, this is a proof of concept trial. So we don't know whether the hypothesis that integrating better nutrition and water sanitation and hygiene will lead to better growth. It's unknown. There's a lot of interest in multi-sectoral approaches to stunting, but we're trying to generate the evidence. And I think Victor mentioned earlier, we're one of 3 trials going on concurrently. There's one called WASH Benefits, which is taking place in Bangladesh, which is due to report in November. And there's a second WASH Benefits site run as a separate trial in Kenya, and that's due to report next year. So within the next 18 months, there will be 3 large-scale randomized controlled trials coming from very different settings, which will hopefully address this question of whether integrating WASH and IYCF does lead to reductions in stunting. And clearly, whatever the results of the randomized intervention, there's a huge amount of learning still to be done about the underlying causes of stunting. That's 63% that's really unexplained so far. And what we hope with the various sub-studies we've described is that we'll be able to get sort of pare away at that piece to understand how much of stunting can we explain and what are the kind of tractable pathways that we need to intervene in the future to really get the burden of stunting down. And so it's really to inform new approaches. So I'm going to leave with this summary, I think, of the trial, where on the left you can see the exposures that we're measuring in this trial. So the key things are this experiment, this randomized design, where we have 4 different groups of babies who have been exposed to a standard of care, to a WASH intervention, to an IYCF intervention, or both together. And on the right is the primary outcome. So looking at stunting and also anemia, which we didn't give much airtime to, but anemia overlaps with stunting. It's also a highly prevalent, intractable problem. And we think that the same interventions might improve both conditions. So that's the main outcome. But the secondary outcome, as Gwen described, early child development, we really want to make smart, productive adults eventually. And so getting a handle on that at the age of 2, how early child development is going, is also important. And then the other secondary outcomes that I described earlier. And then in the bottom left are some add-on studies, things that will give us more information. What's the contribution of HIV, which we know is still around 15% prevalence among antenatal women, of mycotoxin exposure, which we said affects around 30% of women in our preliminary work, of anemia, which is also prevalent in pregnancy, and this condition EED, which we don't know how common that is among pregnant women. So this is the sort of overview of the trial. I'm going to end by just acknowledging all of our partners. So predominantly the Ministry of Health, we work hand in glove with the ministry, and particularly the named collaborators there from 3 different departments, the team at Chitambo, and then our partners at US and UK institutions. And then I'd like to acknowledge the funders of this trial as well. And then we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you, presenters. Time for questions. Introduce yourself. Here's an incentive, since we didn't introduce ourselves. If you ask a question, you get to introduce yourself. Okay? We're trying to solve the 63% conundrum here. I'm sure there are lots of questions.
Diana Patel from Occupy Trust. Just 2 points of clarification. Firstly, why did you decide only to test it? I can't remember what the presentation was now. Only tested babies up to 18 months rather than 2 years. And secondly, are you controlling in any way the differences or investigating the differences in sex?
I'll ask you to speak through the microphone because we're recording this.
Yeah, in the Zimbabwe 2010 DHS data, since it was actually a little bit more prevalent, 18 months, it starts a little less. So it was a financial decision. We could get our biggest statistical bang at 18 months. We cut 6 months off of our 18. So we had now added 6 months in the last 2,000 days, but it was primarily a design question. Sex. We certainly have the sex, I think, on every baby. There may be 1 or 2 that are missing the sex in the database. We will certainly look at that, and that would be always an interesting look at differences in sex and gender.
Questions? Comments?
Thank you. Thank you very much to your team for this great presentations. Clearly, this is a very, very strong trial, and I do believe that once you have all the results, clearly there will be a lot of evidence. I just recently said was one of the partners of one of the funders, but I think it's not too late. Once you have the results, definitely we said that we engage your team to see how we can move forward with those results. Questions. I know you have not presented any results at this time, and that's because the trial is still going on. But maybe on the normal presentation of breastfeeding, which is really very, very interesting, to show that delivery intervention is having a significant effect on the ground. I was just wondering, how many women you have about 69% was breastfeeding at 6 months. So we still have a about 1/3, 30% of the cohort that has been published exclusively breastfeeding. And we just want to let you know why. Why is that happening? The reasons why it is 30% actually be able to breastfeed. And for Laura, very interesting study on the mycotoxins and the issue of aflatoxin, which is clearly one of the problems here in Zimbabwe, but also in Africa. You have touched a little bit on the links or the risk of liver diseases linked to aflatoxin. So I was just wondering if they are also doing or they are planning to look at also hepcidin in your study, because we also look at between hepcidin and anemia. So definitely somehow touching on the aflatoxin. But they are very, very strong Very something. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming and doing this teams.
Since you didn't introduce yourself, this is Mohammed, our new representative to Zimbabwe, for those who don't know. Jane and Laura?
And thought about it. We were so excited to see the rate go from 15 to 67%. So we didn't think, we hadn't thought deeply or looked carefully at what foods were introducing why. We had that data. It may be a design issue of the study, so the fourth module, maybe if it would do another module, 5 months, continue to reinforce it. I think the other thing that we think out of everything that's coming out of Shine so far, the EBF modules are ready for prime time in Zimbabwe. They, as an organization, we've been worried about and looking at how to improve breastfeeding rates for the last 2 decades. I was one of the first groups that showed that HIV positive don't breastfeed. We're at higher risk of breastfeeding, period. And so we were very impressed with how important exclusivity of breastfeeding during this time. So I guess I would say that we think that having interventions that directly affect specific barriers that mothers have at those very early ages around colic. It wasn't around breastfeeding, it was different. And delivering time-targeted, age-targeted interventions that address the barrier that mothers worried about at that time. And maybe we could do even better if we could build it 1 month, 5 months. Maybe we get those.
Thank you. I didn't really touch on, but we have given a lot of thought to how and kind of I think that we still have on our docket and so we will how
Good. See a hand at the back.
My name is I look at this how time in the environment. This says the practice they but it's not maybe it's not said there. I don't know how to fix it. I know it becomes time, but it's and people allow areas like all those areas.
You can do it.
And to say the population density is certainly an important variable in Washington. And of the other 2 large global trials, the one in much more dense sector, which would have equivalents for urban, area-urban.
I mean, so how are you guys and what's the outcome
Thank you. We're fortunate that all three trials received money from the Gates Foundation in Seattle. And so they were interested, the three of us talked to each other. And as we were designing the trials and interventions, and also how we were going to measure the outcomes so that we would be able to compare across countries. So we actually put into our proposal a little bit of money to get together with them once a year, which we've been doing, and had a lot of, in fact, our tippy tap was reported from, have been all validated, and they spent a lot of time working on that in Kenya, and so we directly adopted that for trying. So there, just to say, there's been a lot of conversation and sharing and getting together quite proactively. So.
Giving me another chance. I came to your previous presentation for some years back, and you were then talking about, which really interested me, some sort of playpen system to keep the babies away from chickens, clean area. What has been the outcome? I know you were looking around for something that is sustainable and effective.
Yes, I saw that as well.
We do provide a mat that's made of, it's locally produced, it's the material that meal made bags are made out of, so it's a plasticized mesh mat that's 3 meters square at 2 months, and did decide to import for the purposes of the study a play yard, which is like a little playpen. We worked several months on trying to come up with one that would be more locally available, look more specific like Zimbabwe, and we ran out of time. We had to start the trial, and the safety considerations of making something that a child could get his head stuck in, or all those trumped our efforts to do that, and we instead decided to import something that had already passed through decades and decades of rigorous child protection standardization. Daddy, who's Daddy, put your hand up, who started as a research assistant in Zimbabwe and then went to, is now at Cornell to PhD. One of the things she's going to do starting in November is do much more qualitative work on that playpen and how others have been using it, and whether we've been creating any risks for the baby. We've been reducing exploratory development. Are the chickens in fact roosting inside the playpen, and do we have more chicken pieces inside the playpen than outside the playpen? She'll be looking at that. We're also, since she was one of the original observers, and since we've been really lucky in the last year to have Gwen join us, and 2 investigators from the University of Liverpool who are specialists in child development, we decided to repeat the baby observation study. So Daddy is going to run that from November to February in 180 households, 45 from each arm, 90 washed, 90 non-washed. Look again at what babies are putting in their mouths and how often all these things are going, and see if our intervention has been effective at reducing that mode of transmission. My questionnaire, which is the way we assess that now, at 12 months, at the 12-month time point, about 23% of mothers in the non-wash arms say, yes, I've seen my child eat chicken feces, compared to less than 3% in the wash arm. So, at least by maternal report, it looks like interventions have been effective. But we would like to know, we would like to get some more observational data to really be able to understand that, because that is a unique part of SHINE. The studies in Kenya and Bangladesh did not try to go after chicken feces or geophagia. They looked at our baby observation study and decided that they were going to focus instead on just conventional WASH interventions. So it's the unique piece of SHINE amongst the 3 trials, and we want to understand it, get into, be a fly on the wall and understand as well as we can what's really going on and how, what are the pathways of interest in babies.
I have a round of questions. But we wait until January 28th.
One that we really think is ready for prime time right now is WASH. That has, it's such an important child health issue, and it has the potential to save so many baby lives. And because this trial was done here, we really spent a lot of time and energy understanding specific barriers to death in Zimbabwe. And we think that for the first time, as an organization, we understand that much better. And we would love to see that rolled out from the 400 village health workers in these 2 districts, 25,000 village health workers. So we're talking to David. Mrs. Domingo has been meeting with Maggie Kavida, here to himself, who is the village health national strategy, to see how those interventions might integrate into the next village health.
Have any of these findings been
Yeah, our 3 of our co-investigators are the director of environmental health with director. So we built in to the design of the team ongoing. Initially, that was to make sure that we weren't going to do anything in SHINE, which would be contradictory to child care policy and program. But second, so that they were with us as we're thinking through this and as we're going through this and answering questions. And they are part of the team that answers the questions. Really together or not. So I would say for the IYCF and the WASH intervention, our preliminary data shows that, particularly we've been looking at WASH, the WASH interventions have improved WASH behavior. Picking that apart further and saying, well, how much of it was because of building the latrine, totally subsidized. There's a big leap to going from a proof of concept of a child to a program. And we're looking to guidance, especially from bilateral donors who are interested in developing Zimbabwe like we did, and UNICEF, of course, to help us with that big leap as these results come out over the next year and a half, and as we know what actually works and how it's worked, we're really looking to all of the rest of you and this best way, especially here in Zimbabwe.
question. You mentioned that why is they also bought this several other animals. Why don't you look at animals? That's not specific.
Or even humans, right?
Has this been true?
Mostly it's just how many change. There's just so many, they're the most common, and there's just many, and the roadrunners are everywhere, and many areas of children. They're also, it turns out, quite unoffensive. These species, they change food. They don't smell or evidently taste too bad. Instead of poisons in drugs, you know, I think that's what makes it different.
Any of the researchers tested
Yeah, that's what we're having for the brown baby.
It's out there, brown bags, as you go out. You don't have a beggar. And there's beef in the beggar, there's also a drink out there. Let me now thank Jin, Andrew, Naomi, Gwen, and Laura for this excellent presentation. Needless to say, we've been hearing about this for quite a while now, and all of us cannot just wait for results. And thank you very much. This presentation will be available on YouTube. So you can just Google UNICEF Zimbabwe YouTube account to find it. And then for those of you who would like the presentation itself, you have it on this computer. So thank you very much for coming. We'll let you know when the next round will be. Thank you.
Really